Tonight, we thank you for being here or watching online. If you please stand with us while we worship. Who has held the ocean in his hand? Who has numbered every grain of sand? Kings and kingdoms tremble at his voice. All creation rises to rejoice. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore. Given counsel to the Lord, who can question any of his words? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all his wondrous deeds? Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has felt the nails upon his hands, bearing all the guilt of sinful man? God eternal, humble to the grave, Jesus Savior, risen now to reign. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Thank you. You may be seated.
Prepare my own stuff. There we go. Oh, thank you, sweetheart. We are in Daniel 11 this evening, and Daniel 11 is kind of well known for just being a very meticulous, super detailed, tons of information chapter. And I even heard a story of a pastor who was talking about one of his Bible school professors. And if he wanted to know kind of what sort of student you would be, he would assign you Daniel 11. And then he would, not because it's hard to interpret, because it's so full of information and historical detail, he would find out if you were a detail-oriented person or not. So Daniel 11 is prophecy that we can see kind of lived out as narrative history. And the question is kind of, why is it important? And I think so much of the way through Daniel, we're just reminded again and again that all of history, all the things that unfold in the world are in God's hands. If you remember last week, Gabriel appears and informs Daniel of all these things that are going on behind the scenes that he didn't know about. That there's angels and demons wrestling over nations and rulers and kings. And Daniel had no idea that that was going on. And now we get to see a glimpse into that. And so even in the midst of all these things that go on in our world, there are things going on behind the scenes that we don't know, that we're not privy to. And more importantly, God is at work to accomplish His will. He allows things for a season and then brings them to an end. He's working toward His end in history. And again, the book of Daniel kind of reminds us that God is sovereign. And even in the midst of dark days, God is strong on behalf of His people, especially His people that are standing boldly for Him. So that's why even this is important when we get into all this detail. It reminds us that God's in control. It reminds us that God has a plan. It also should remind us that time and time again across the history of the world, people and rulers and nations have had designs on destroying Israel. And any nation that puts its mind and its forces to destroy Israel ends up destroyed. And usually what ends up happening is that Israel gets a new feast. There is the Passover when Egypt is out to put Israel under its thumb. God destroys Egypt and gives them a new feast to celebrate how He's carried them through. We've been talking in this book that Antiochus Epiphanes is out to destroy Israel. He ends up being destroyed, and Israel celebrates Hanukkah. And someday we look forward to another day when world rulers, in their attempt to destroy Israel, but it will end with the marriage supper of the Lamb. So just by way of a little reminder, when we get to this tail end of the book, the main figure we see come to the front is the Antichrist. And in chapter 7, there's this symbolic vision. He is the little horn. In chapter 8, the wicked king. In chapter 9, we see he's this person that makes a covenant with Israel. In chapter 11, we're going to see a lot more information about the Antichrist, again, just as it reveals more and more things about the historical figure Antiochus Epiphanes, but he is a historical type of the Antichrist to come. So this is a difficult passage just because there's so much things there. So normally every week I try to read through every verse. This week I'm going to skip big sections and just try to give you a quick summary of what goes on. And if you're like a history person and you find this interesting, if you just Google Daniel 11 and history, you will just be given reams and reams of articles and tons of things. And it was just too much to try to fit in tonight. So I'm going to focus on kind of more of the last half of the chapter. So remember, so Gabriel was speaking to Daniel last week. And so he says here in verse 1, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him." So this is heaven's help behind the scenes of Persia. Why? Because God is using Persia to destroy wicked Babylon. Verse 2, "Now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece." So this is Persia and what will happen after them. The 4th king is a king named Xerxes. He's the same guy that the book of Esther talks about, whose name is Ahasuerus. Pretty good, I pronounced that. And so he is going to oppose Greece, and he will lose. Okay, verse 3, "And a mighty king will arise, And he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. So this mighty king, we've seen over and over again, this same kind of revealing of world kingdoms, but we keep kind of getting them from different perspectives or with different information added. And so again, this is Alexander the Great. He conquers the world. And remember, we said in all these cases, there's some mention of after Alexander the Great, there's 4 something. And this time it talks about the 4 points of the compass. Alexander had no children. He had 4 generals. So his kingdom is divided amongst those generals after him. And it says, though he had no descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. Okay. Now, of those 4 generals, we've mentioned them several times, but this is going to talk about 2 of them. Verse 5, the king of the north will grow strong, and along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him, obtain dominion. Okay, so the king of the south is the general Ptolemy. And so that is in the area of Egypt. He rules Egypt. And then it's going to talk about the king of the north, which was General Seleucus. He ruled over the Syrian area, and both of them fought over Israel because that was kind of a tactical area, and they both wanted that region. Okay? Verses 5 through 9, if you just read through it, gives all these details about the Syrian-Phoenician War, and just meticulous detail that should give you great confidence in God's Word, just how God reveals things hundreds of years before they happen. Verse 10 through 12 is the advent of Antiochus the Great. Okay, now that is Antiochus Epiphanes' father, Antiochus the Great. And verse 13 through 16 is about how he basically wrestles the Holy Land away from Egyptian control. Now he hopes to get advantage over Egypt. And so what Antiochus the Great in verses 17 through 19 describes, he's going to give his daughter, Cleopatra, by the way, in marriage to Ptolemy. And he thinks that's going to give him an advantage. The problem is Cleopatra sided with her new husband, and he got no advantage at all. So Antiochus then, he loses a battle against Roman forces, and after his defeat, he has to kind of surrender his great elephant brigade that he had and some of his forces. 20 selected hostages were taken off to Rome, one of those being his son, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is his formative years are spent in Rome. So that's all that detail happens in those verses. That brings us to 21, and we're going to focus on Antiochus Epiphanes because that looks forward. Verse 21, in this place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Okay? So he wasn't the rightful ruler of anything. He didn't become a king in the typical way. But in a time of tranquility, in a time of peace, he starts bargaining with other people and other nations. He ends up kind of cutting a deal with some people in Egypt, and all through not by military force, not because of his parentage. He rises to power because of the way he kind of schemes and connives and pays people off behind the scenes. Verse 22, the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered. And also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. He will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder and booty and possessions among them. It's him buying influence. He will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army of war, but he will not stand, for his schemes will be devised against him. Okay, those who eat of his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. So he gains control, but he does it through deception. This small group of people are people from Egypt. I mean, this is all just history. This happened. And Antiochus defeats the southern king, but his allies are going to turn against him. Verse 27, as for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed. For the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. So there's this open hostility. Antiochus has viciously slaughtered any Jews who wanted to obey biblical instruction and worship. His goal is to make all the world Greek. But again, this kind of reminds us God is sovereign, evil is not sovereign, and evil will end in its due time. It says his heart is against the holy covenant. It's against God's people. And it says, at the appointed time he will return and come into the south, come into Egypt. But this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. So he returns to kind of finalize his power. And then it says, for ships of Kittim will come against him. Kittim is Cyprus. So from kind of beyond the sea, from Cyprus is Rome. And that's what's being looked at there. And so the Roman Empire is going to come, and it's going to defeat Syria in 65 BC. It's going to defeat Egypt in 30 BC, but that's still kind of future. There's a point when Antiochus is away that there's kind of an uprising in Israel, and they kick his priest out of the temple. And then when Antiochus returns, he is furious. And it says, he will be disheartened. He will return, become enraged at the holy covenant, and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant, those who abandon their belief, he shows regard for. Forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up an abomination of desolation. When Antiochus returns, he's so angry at being opposed that is the time where he sets up a statue of Zeus in the temple. He sacrifices a pig on the altar. They spread pig entrails all around, an unclean animal, all around the temple, so that observant Jews couldn't even enter their own temple. Verse 32, by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. Again, God's covenant people. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. So the Maccabees, Judas Maccabees, revolt against Antiochus, and they are going to defeat Antiochus. And this says that God grants them a little help. The reason why it's called a little help isn't just because God's just like, maybe just a little. It's the idea that it's temporary. It's not permanent. God's going to give them a season of victory, but it's not going to last forever, at least not until the kingdom. Verse 35, some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Okay? So now we've seen that phrase before, this time of the end or the end times. And when we see that, we're kind of transported past the church age, and we're kind of looking at the future. But there's still things here that kind of reference Antiochus. But again, it's a type of what the Antichrist will be like. at the appointed time. Verse 36. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished. For that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god. He will magnify themselves above all. So, here is this ruler who's going to do as he pleases, which basically is to exalt himself. And the things it says about him is that he has no regard for the gods of his fathers. So this is a Gentile. So it's even speaking of like pagan deities. This person has no regard not only for the Most High, the God of gods, the only God, but he has no regard for any other religion either. And so the idea is, here's someone who is just a complete, a true atheist. Someone who is completely amoral. Someone who basically makes a god of himself, and he determines what is right and wrong. And he's going to say in a minute what he thinks right is. There's an interesting phrase here. It says, shows no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. Okay? That's an interesting phrase. Now, some people think that means that whoever the Antichrist is, that he'll be a homosexual individual. I don't think that's it at all, because it's in the sense of about gods and kind of just kind of a bigger picture, I think, of what he's like. And I think the idea is, and there's a couple commentaries here that agree with me, but the idea is, what is the most basic human relationship is for a husband and wife. And here's someone who, just the most basic foundation of society and governments, and even of churches, the basic building blocks are families. And here's someone who doesn't even have, the most basic relationship is a love relationship, and this person has no relationship of love. This is a person who has no love, no compassion, no mercy, not even for a special someone, for no one. Okay? So no love, no affection for anyone, even on the most basic level. Instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold and costly stones and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Okay? So what does this guy think right and wrong is? Force, power, wealth, enough wealth to do what you want. He does this with the help of a foreign god. I think that refers to Satan. Someone who is an usurper, someone who doesn't belong as God of this world. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. So he honors those that honor him, and he controls land and riches and wealth. And and if you go to Revelation 6, and as these seals are being opened, the first is the Antichrist appears, and what comes after him is war and famine, scarcity, and death, as this one controls who has land, who has things. Revelation tells us that if you don't take his mark, you're not able to buy and sell. So that is this one. It's a good place off in the margin of your Bible to just write 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 10. That's Paul's description of the same individual and this man of lawlessness. And Paul's description of what he's like just follows right down through this passage, how he rise to power through intrigue, Same kind of idea. Right, verse 40. At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and horsemen, basically with all their power. He will enter countries, overflow them, pass through. He will also enter the beautiful land, that's Israel. So imagine here this king of the south, king of the north. Before that was Egypt and Syria. Now we're looking ahead in time. The same kind of similar areas, but there's a coalition of forces that come against the Antichrist. Why would that be? Okay. Ezekiel 38 describes a northern coalition, the king of Rosh, the idea that it's Russia, and the king of the south, which is, and so think about it, how many of these Russian bloc nations are now primarily Islamic? Islam is the prominent religion of those countries. And then to the south is all these other Arab countries. Now, why would a whole bunch of Islamic nations want to rise against the Antichrist?
Doesn't care about their religion.
He's got a covenant with it.
Antichrist made a deal, right? He made a covenant with Israel. And that stirs things up. And so now these nations come against him. And it's at this time that the Antichrist enters the beautiful land. He enters Israel. Verse 42, then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, over the precious things of Egypt, and Libyans and Ethiopians will fall at his heels. Okay? So he enters into, Daniel 9 tells us that he's going to break his covenant with Israel. Revelation 16 describes all these bowl and trumpet judgments, and all the things as there's all these wars and destruction in the world. Verse 44 says, but rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. So there's these rumors, basically the Antichrist, his kingdom is going to be crumbling under the coming judgment of God. And that's what the last half of the tribulation is all about, is God's great judgment on the earth. He will pitch tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. He's in Jerusalem. He's there. He's announced himself as kind of the world's Messiah. And then this chapter, after giving us all this history and all this stuff that happens, and here's this Antichrist who is powerful and cruel and deceptive, like Antiochus was, and he comes to power and he's at war with nations. And how is all this summed up? What is God's take on this individual and these world systems? Just one verse. Actually, not even a whole verse. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. How does God see this fearsome Antichrist who has conquered the world and controls if people can eat and buy and sell? God says he'll come to an end, and no one's going to be able to help him either. Boom, done. Okay. So all that just to say that there's just so much detail in what God reveals about what's happening in history, and God allows evil for a season, but evil isn't sovereign. It isn't free to go on as long as it likes. Wicked men and wicked spiritual forces and destructive schemes are only permitted as long as God allows. And then God is going to bring it to an end. And it's going to come to an end, and no one can help it. I did notice, I found an article this week from the New York Times, and it's from August 2021, so it's a couple years old. But the article was, and you can Google it if you want, So it was about how Israel used to have a policy of, so there's the Wailing Wall, and Jews are allowed to pray there. But they had sort of made a policy where Jews were not allowed to pray up on the Temple Mount. And there's, it's all under the, kind of the control of Israeli police, but they've also let Jordan have kind of jurisdiction over that area too. And there's a small police office up on the Temple Mount, kind of quietly tucked off to the side. And if you're up there praying, in the past, Israeli police would come by and they would shoo you off of there if you were Jews praying. Why? Because they didn't want to. Every time there's ever been some kind of discussion of Jews worshiping on the Temple Mount, it has resulted in some kind of uproar, with the Palestinians and other Arabs and Islamists in that area. And it always produces a fight, the 11-day war, all kind of things. Israel has done away with that policy. And now, previously only Muslims could worship there, and Jews had to be at the Western Wall. But now they are permitting Jews to openly pray there. And there's increasing hostility with the Islamic community. So that's just praying there. Imagine how kind of the world would explode if there was a temple there and there was Jewish worship there and there was sacrifices to Yahweh there. I'm not saying that's, this is the start of, something, but it's like, man, it's not hard to imagine how the kind of powder keg of events that happen that the Antichrist sets off when you can just see other things that are even just smaller little bits of that, and it causes a big problem. So anyway, just kind of be encouraged that believers know the future, and we can kind of put all of our eggs in God's basket, and and anticipate what God's going to do. I think it's always a good question. I think one of the reasons why God always tells us things in the future is so we can ask ourselves, what kind of follower of God should I be in light of this information? In light of what God is going to do, then what kind of Christian should I be? And hopefully it causes us to kind of cry out like John does, even so, Lord, come quickly. Anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments, Gene?
I got two questions. One is, when you're talking about that he had an end, is that at the 3.5 mark or at the 7-year mark? Did he have an end? And Titus, is that
Talking
who?
about destruction.
What's that?
Talks about, that's talking about Christ is going to end him. That'd be at the end of the 7 years.
Oh,
That'd be at
okay.
the end of the tribulation.
That's kind of what I thought, okay.
Yeah, he breaks the covenant in the middle of the tribulation period,
okay.
and then there is Armageddon still has to play out. Those things, that's all in the second half of the tribulation period.
Right. And the other one is, if the Jewish people are allowed to worship up there, they're not allowed to go into the mosque of Umar, are they? I don't think they'd allow that to Muslims.
They can probably go in there.
I've been in there, but that was years ago.
But I think it would cause an international outrage if Jews went in there and prayed. Mm-hmm. If they did anything openly religious there. Mm-hmm. If they just walk in, I don't know.
Okay.
But what I was talking about isn't even what the Palestinians or the Arabs would allow. It was what Israel itself was allowing. That it was Israel's policy to not allow Jews to pray on the Temple Mount because they didn't want to risk that. And now they're allowing that. They've reversed their policy, and Jews can pray there. So that's the part that I think's interesting.
Did you know that lately two of the people in the Knesset or whatever tried to get a law made that anybody who was proselytized, especially Christians probably, but that they would go to jail for a year unless it was somebody under 18 years of age, and they would go for 2 years if they tried to proselytize somebody under 18. But thankfully, it didn't happen. But I thought, boy, that sounds like current day Pharisees to me, you know, to not allow. How many people wouldn't come on their tours if they were told, don't talk about Jesus or your religion to anybody, or you'll go to jail. So I'm glad they didn't. They were not successful, those two leaders, and they've been in it for a long time. It's not like they're just a new person in there.
Yeah. No, I hadn't heard that.
It was on TBN about a couple weeks ago.
Anyone else? Great.
So Israel has like allies around them that would be mad if the Antichrist broke his treaty or whatever he makes. Is that why they would attack? Or?
No. The Israel really has no allies except for the Antichrist, who appears as their ally. But again, he's deceptive. He's scheming. And so I'm saying, you know, it's easy to imagine the couple areas that the Bible describes as turning on the Antichrist are heavily Islamic areas. And since the Antichrist, one of the big things we know about him is that he makes a covenant with Israel. That makes sense. It makes sense why if someone who is becoming this world leader, all these nations have kind of given him power, and then like he does something with Israel, be like, oh, wait a minute, we don't like that. And then in response to that, you know, he goes into the temple, and that's when there's the you know, this desecration of this temple. That's when he really declares himself to, you know, worship me. So
Makes sense.
Israel is really alone, you know, in every sense.
In spite of the Abrahamic Accords that were signed lately? What that time would be different, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
So next week is chapter 12, and we're going to see how God brings all this to a close. Chapter 12 is great. It's going to be a fun chapter to look at, and then we have to figure out what we're going to study next in prayer meeting. So if you have any ideas of what you might like to do, let me know. And then if I agree, then we'll do it. Okay. How can we pray for one another today?
I have to told you guys in